From classrooms to coffins. The children who defied apartheid. I still remember the story of the children of Soweto, young students who had the courage to stand up against a system designed to crush every spark of resistance. They were children, some as young as 12, who carried nothing more than books in their hands and determination in their hearts. They looked at their schools, their neighborhoods, and their future, and they refused to accept a life that would be written in chains. But the extraordinary courage of children who should have been safe in classrooms, laughing on playgrounds, dreaming of futures untouched by politics. They marched with school bags on their backs, pencils still in their pockets, and songs on their lips. And yet they carried themselves with the strength of warriors. Some were not even teenagers, barely tall enough to look a soldier in the eye. Some carried cardboard banners painted with words of defiance. Others clutched one another's hands as if drawing courage from touch alone. The final spark that set everything ablaze was language itself. It was as if they wanted to erase every trace of identity, to force children to think, to dream. Afrikaans was not only difficult for them to learn, it was a symbol of domination. I can almost hear their whispers growing into shouts, their frustration turning into determination. For these young students, the imposition of Afrikaans was the final insult in a long list of injustices, and they decided they would no longer bow to it. Thousands of students dressed in their school uniforms, holding makeshift signs, gathered with a plan to march peacefully toward Orlando Stadium. They were not carrying weapons, only their voices and their courage. The police, already waiting, saw not children but enemies, and they positioned themselves with guns loaded and tear gas ready. Then the shots rang out, the air filled with screams, the chaos of children running, choking on tear gas, stumbling over one another. What was meant to be a peaceful protest became one of the darkest chapters in our history, and the ground of Soweto was stained with the blood of its children. Those mothers prayed their children would come back tired from shouting, perhaps hoarse from singing, but still alive. There is no pain deeper than burying a child, and Soweto forced hundreds of families into that agony. The brutality of the police that day revealed something terrifying. The system was so fragile, so insecure, that it felt threatened by children. Children who had gone out to demand dignity found themselves running from tear gas, stumbling over fallen friends, hiding behind walls, and bleeding on the streets where they had once played. The very spaces of their childhood, schools, playgrounds, neighborhoods, were transformed into battlefields. Soweto became a graveyard of youth, but also the birthplace of a new determination. He was only 12 years old, barely stepping into adolescence, yet he became the face of a movement he never chose to lead. I imagine his last moments, the confusion in his young eyes, the fear, and then silence. Hector's short life ended in the dust of Soweto, but his name became immortal, forever tied to the struggle for freedom. I can see it as clearly as if it were in front of me now. Hector's body, limp in the arms of Mbuyisa Makhubo, his sister Antoinette running alongside, her face frozen in horror and grief. That image froze the world. No one could dismiss it as propaganda. No one could deny the truth of a child's lifeless body carried by trembling arms. Photographs can do what words often cannot. They pierce the soul, they strip away excuses, they make denial impossible. This one picture, more powerful than 1,000 speeches, showed the cruelty of apartheid in its rawest form, and the tears of those who realized that the suffering of South Africa's children could no longer be ignored. They claimed that only 23 had died, calling it an unfortunate clash, a misunderstanding. More than 700 were killed, many of them shot in the back as they fled. To live through that moment was to understand the depth of cruelty we faced. The state did not hesitate to murder children to preserve its power. Every funeral was a protest, every grave a reminder that our lives meant nothing to them. The reason the world came to know the truth was because of the bravery of journalists who risked everything to tell our story. They smuggled photographs, wrote articles under threat of prison, and carried our cries to the outside world. I think about the courage it took for photographers like Sam Nzima to snap the photo of Hector, knowing that the regime's police could destroy both the film and his life. Yet he did it, because he knew the world needed to see. Journalism in that moment was not just reporting, it was resistance. And through their courage, our suffering crossed borders and broke through walls of indifference. Until then, many nations had been content to look away, to trade with South Africa, to shake hands with its leaders, to pretend that apartheid was merely internal policy. The silence began to crack, and calls for sanctions grew louder. Universities boycotted South African goods. Musicians refused to play in Sun City. The massacre of Soweto was not the beginning of our struggle, but it was the beginning of the world's awakening. I felt for the first time that maybe we were not fighting alone, that perhaps the world's conscience had finally been stirred. Even in prison, Nelson Mandela heard of the massacre, and his reaction carried weight across the movement. He was locked away in Robben Island, yet the news pierced through the walls of stone and iron. I imagine his face as he learned that children had been killed in the streets, his heart heavy with grief, but his resolve only strengthened. For years, they had tried to silence him, to bury his voice, but this news would have reminded him that the struggle was alive outside those walls. His reaction, passed in whispers among prisoners, was that Soweto'S children had paid the price of freedom and that their courage would not be forgotten. Even behind bars, Mandela was part of that moment, connected to the people by pain and by determination. The massacre gave new meaning to his sacrifice, and it deepened the resolve of all who still carried the torch of resistance. Sport, too, became a battlefield after Soweto. One by one, international sports bodies expelled South Africa, refusing to let its teams play. Rugby, cricket, soccer, all became symbols of resistance. I remember the pride when crowds abroad booed our teams, not because they hated the players, but because they despised the system they represented. Musicians wrote songs, athletes spoke out, and boycotts spread far beyond stadiums. Sport, once used as propaganda by the regime, became a weapon in the hands of the oppressed. Every canceled match, every empty seat in an international arena was a reminder that apartheid was becoming a pariah. It was as if the cheers of Soweto's children had echoed into arenas across the globe, transforming sport into protest. Those children, armed only with their voices, exposed the cruelty of apartheid more powerfully than any army could. Their bravery sparked a chain of events that shook the world and set the course for apartheid's eventual downfall. Hector Pieterson's face still looks back at us from that photograph, reminding us of the cost of freedom. Soweto became a symbol not only for South Africa, but for oppressed people everywhere, proof that even the smallest voices can shake empires. The image of Hector Pieterson crystallized that reality for the world. But he was only one of hundreds. Behind his face were countless others whose names we do not know, children whose stories ended before they could be told. Some were aspiring doctors, teachers, musicians, dreamers whose futures were erased in seconds. It is easy to focus on one photograph, but we must remember that every child lost was a universe extinguished. Every name forgotten was a dream denied. When I imagine those classrooms, once full of chatter and laughter, suddenly half empty after the massacre, I feel the weight of history pressing down. The courage of those children did not die with them. Their younger brothers and sisters, inspired by their sacrifice, grew up determined to finish the struggle. The massacre of Soweto was not the end, but the beginning of a larger resistance that spread across townships, into universities, and into the global consciousness. The children taught the world something that day, that innocence could be more powerful than armies, and that a child's cry for freedom could echo louder than the roar of guns. And so, when we speak of Soweto, we must not only speak of tragedy, but also of legacy. The children showed us that courage has no age, that dignity can be demanded even by the smallest voices. They remind us that oppression often underestimates the power of youth, and that change often begins when the young refuse to inherit the injustices of the past. Their march was short, but its footsteps still resound in the corridors of history, guiding us toward a world where no child should ever have to die for the right to learn.